more a way of organizing the world around me. And yeah, I was always just drawn to the photograph. And I didn't start taking them until I was 14 or so. I mean, I went to art school. I made really bad paintings and sculptures and videos, and it all sort of always felt like it was bringing me back to photography. I was reading this thing, like 1 billion photographs are made every single day now. So for me, a big question for me in my studio is, what is this adding? It feels almost like callous or aggressive to put another image into the world and to give it this more rarefied status, right? Like, why should this picture hang on a wall in a frame? So I've always been drawn to photographs where it sort of seems like we can reduce the amount of confusion or things in the world, like something where I can cut through to something rather than adding more to it. This is Hotchkiss versus Taft, number 6. I shot this 3 years ago. This felt exciting to me because it felt like, despite the 1 billion photographs being made every day, that there was something novel or some question of access here where I was able to photograph this game, and that's not something that everybody can see. This happens behind a gate. It was an enormous logistical hassle for me to be able to photograph it. And it's a part of our history that I think is a little underexplored. I think it's something people aren't comfortable thinking about and something we should talk about more. So this is an image of girls in high school playing lacrosse. And lacrosse is a Native American sport. The Native Americans called it the little brother of war, and they would play it to practice combat. It was also a spiritual ritual, and that still exists to this day. Native American tribes play this. Europeans came and they organized a sport and gave it rules. The name actually comes from French missionaries thought that that stick looked like a bishop's crook, la crosse. So they found a way to structure it so that it would exclude Native Americans from playing. And the game evolved to be something that represents whiteness in our culture, the elite in our culture. These two schools are part of, it's called the 8 Schools League, and it historically and still sort of prepares quite literally like the governing classes of America, some senators, presidents, bankers, lawyers, for college. So I was doing some research into these schools, and the Taft School was founded by either the uncle or brother of one of our presidents, so powerful political family. And then the Hotchkiss School was founded by the wife of a prominent rifle manufacturer, so sort of akin to Winchester. So we have in this image also like an allusion to the company that helped facilitate the extermination of this population, that invented this sport. It was an incredibly dark part of history, incredibly perverse, but also the sport to witness is like very impressive and beautiful. And that kind of push and pull there was something that attracted me to it. In that way, it feels like I can sort of slice through so many layers of what's going on. We have this dark colonial past. We have women behaving violently towards one another, which I thought was super exciting to be able to depict that. It's something I'd never seen. These incredible athletes, their agency. I was also reading about, there's this statistic that 95% of female CEOs of major companies have played organized sports. Bourdieu writes about this as well, but that the sort of leadership skills or teamwork, even this language is carried over to the corporate world. So you see quite literally preparation for a life of power or leadership. Obsessed is an okay word. It is something that I really feel like we should be talking about, and it's sort of sprung into the national debate in a more direct way in the last couple of years, and that's been extremely interesting for me in terms of making the work at the same time. There's this mythology that we all sort of seem like we still subscribe to, that it would be possible for anyone to make their way with the right pluck, and yet we have like more social and economic stratification than ever before. I think it's like worse than Russian society. And it was interesting for me, just it felt like there is this group of people who are making decisions that deeply affect our country, and yet we're not depicting them in art. We're not talking about what's going on. And that was something that I had access to growing up, but also I felt super excited all of a sudden about, like, again, this urgency. It felt like, oh, there is this thing which is not really being depicted so much, at least in photography. We have this maybe in the history of painting, but historically, photography has been like very much aligned with an idea of democracy or an idea of depicting the working classes. And so for me, it was exciting to turn that onto a group of people who really didn't seem like they wanted to be depicted at all. They seemed very invested in covering their tracks or being as modest or liberal or inoffensive as possible. And that's sort of the way that I was raised, so it also felt like an enormous risk or betrayal in terms of it's not something you're supposed to talk about, let alone depict.
Yet they're all over in, for example, commercial photography.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot about also, there's a sort of term like luxury creep, like our sort of depiction of a lot of movies or commercials or television will depict this sort of false middle class, which is actually like an extremely wealthy family in a large house with 3 kids. And that sort of standard of living is not attainable by many people anymore. So for that to be sort of presented in the media as the default middle or normal is interesting. The staging, there was these moments that I wanted to show that happened really quickly, and sort of, again, I wanted to depict a group of people that didn't want to be depicted, but I also wasn't interested so much in scrutinizing or pointing a finger at any actual individuals, and rather thinking about the behaviors. So I thought if I picked out the clothing and the props and the setting and cast models to act these things out, it sort of points it all back at me, first of all, and also lets me show a moment that we wouldn't otherwise see. So something like the boys putting bumper stickers on this car was interesting for me because it's this like literal construction of identity, right? There's sort of the Patagonia sticker or the Amherst College or Save Tibet, those sort of seem like really small gestures, yet in a certain world, those are real like tribal markers of your affiliations or political leanings or subjectivity. And yeah, it also betrays a certain class position, right? Would totally destroy the paint job of a car. I thought that was super exciting, and that's something I remember from growing up. The bumper stickers were important, and putting those on a sort of European luxury car in this very light manner was interesting to me. I mean, one thing I've been noticing in my pictures is I like to get quite close to the subject I'm depicting. And that for me was a way of sort of telegraphing my own closeness to it, but also that we could then allow the viewer to feel it as well. So then there's a lot that's not shown when you're that close in, cropped in. And that, again, props, clothing, the actors, that's super interesting to me, sort of like the boy with cupping marks on his back, or the boy who's on crutches because he was injured on a ski trip. But those are sort of things that point to a larger narrative outside the frame. Sort of developed this little system for myself because I have lots of ideas and I will write them down. And then I've just started to use time. So, I mean, the lacrosse project I think is 6 years in the making. So it was 4 years of sort of thinking about, it kept coming back to me, sort of tapping me on the shoulder. And after 3 or 4 years of that, I think, okay, this is something that's sort of worthwhile or seems like it's important to me. And then I will go after making that image. And then there'll be probably another year or two on the editing side of thinking, was I successful in going after this? But that, just sort of learned to sort of try and use time as a way to vet these ideas, pit them one against one another. That's also something I'm not interested in at all. It's like making judgments. It's much more about what happens if we just describe these things as accurately as possible. I think we have plenty of stuff in the world, and I try to be as concise as possible. So if it can be said with 6 images instead of 15, then that's the way to go. I think there's something really interesting for me about that push and pull between the lightness of the image and then the heaviness of the history, or the social dynamics that are at play underneath.